Hi, everybody. I wanted to bring your attention to a few things that I saw, some main trends that I think are taking shape in our discussion this week of the Electoral College. There's a couple of things that I wanted to point out right off the bat. One, many of you are seizing on the argument made in the textbook and some other places that the Electoral College is really important for ensuring regional representation of the presidency. One of the things that only a few of you have picked up on is that there's really no reason to think that the presidential office should be regionally representative. At least one argument is that it doesn't make legislation, at least not in theory. The executive also isn't in charge of overseeing the legislative process. So it enacts and executes laws rather than makes them. The Constitution actually did stipulate how regional differences would be applied to the legislative process, and that's in the Senate. So in the Senate, we actually do have a body which has a lot of power over overseeing the executive, maintaining the legislative process, and does have a series of roles in things like foreign affairs and the judiciary, which is clearly regionally diverse. Each state is represented equally, and each state gets to voice its direct interest in the policy-making process. So this is not to say those of you who have focused on the regional differences in the Electoral College is important, but it is to say that there is a very clear counter-argument to this that you should understand. The other thing that I would point out is many of you pointing out to the theoretical perspective that the Electoral College is supposed to be a form of sober second thought, mediating the electorate from the actual election of an executive. The problem is that doesn't actually happen in practice. So one of the things we should keep in mind in political science is always look for the difference between theory and practice, and when we try to understand where power comes from. And the Electoral College in the modern era has never actually seen delegates show up who don't vote for the person who won the popular vote in their state. They don't hold debates. They don't have discussions. They don't in any way vet the popular vote in the way the framers intended. They simply show up and cast their ballot for the person who won the popular vote in their state, and many states have actually taken legislative action to ensure they do so. So it's not actually all that clear that they even do function that way, but what they do is funnel the popular vote in particular kinds of ways. There's a few other points that I wanted to bring up right there as well. One of the ones is that we should take a look at what it is the Electoral College actually does when it muddles with the popular vote. So many of you were picking up on this theme in your discussion. So here's a map of the United States for the 2016 election and the presidential election. And what we see is that the map sort of sorts people based on the boundaries of their states. And you start to see this familiar phenomenon. We see blue on left and right, a couple of key states in the middle, and then red dominates the rest of the map, which is less heavily populated. Now, what's interesting is that we can adjust this map by a cartogram for population. And what we start to see here is that at the state level, the balance between Democratic and Republican states is actually far less drastic. So because the left and the right, the blue states are so much more heavily populated, they overrepresent. The same thing actually happens, and things get even more interesting when we look at the county level. So this is the county level electoral map from 2016, and what we see is that the red counties vastly outnumber the blue counties. And this is where that regional differentiation takes place. Because if we adjust this map for population, we actually see that the majority of Americans actually live in those blue counties, and there's only a small number of them. We can also change this cartograph again, and now we're going to look at the county level, but we're going to look by coded for actual partisan perspective. And what we find out is that the United States is not as staunchly divided as you might see. So here, people are not simply noted by county as a county being left-right, sort of bright red or bright blue. They're graduated on a scale. And what happens is that we see that the country is pretty clearly more moderate than we might expect. And this is from the 2016 election. This is starker than purple maps of the past. This is called the Purple America map. But when we adjust that by population, we start to see that the majority population is far more moderate or democratic than we would expect given the electoral outcomes. So what I mean to illustrate with these is that when we talk about the electoral outcomes at the state level, this is the sort of thing that they're doing. And if we go back and look at the Electoral College map, what's starting to happen is that small numbers of people who live in specific states start to dominate the presidential system. Now, there was another thing that I wanted to point out just as food for thought to a few of you, because a few of you started saying that you think that the Electoral College forces presidents to be more responsive to a larger number of states. And I'm going to play devil's advocate and argue against that in a very particular kind of way. Because if we actually look at the outcome of American elections, what we see is that most states are reliably either Democratic or Republican. So due to their demographics or their position in the country, we don't really talk about them very much in any given electoral year because we sort of assume what they're going to be. Presidential candidates will visit to sort of rile up their base, but they don't actually expend huge amounts of energy there. Also, what ends up happening is presidents don't go to states where they don't think that they can actually win the Electoral College votes. So that argument that candidates would both have to sort of moderate and find ways to talk to all states is sort of not what happens in practice. Instead, they make a decision as to which states they're going to go to and which states they're not and really follow that. What the Electoral College does do, though, is it gives rise to the swing state phenomenon. So what starts to happen, so the argument goes, is that because presidents don't have to win the general popular vote, and for various reasons there are lots of states that they can sort of take for granted, there's only a few states that they really focus on. And you see this in presidential campaigning where presidents spend a lot of time in swing states, states that are actually up for grabs and have enough electoral college votes to matter. So if we look at the 2016 election, there were a few key swing states. And if we look at the states where Clinton did really well, I mean, these are the sort of normal, the usual suspects, of sort of some key Midwest states like Illinois, Western states like Colorado and Nevada, then the sort of East and West coasts. And then we look at where Trump won. I mean, he reliably won the states that we would consider staunchly conservative, so Missouri, Texas, Georgia, Kentucky, North Carolina, so on and so forth. Which meant that the race was actually not decided by winning those states. It was decided by what happened in a few key states, namely Florida, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania. And what's interesting here is that these are the states that presidents spend most of their time talking to. These are the states that presidents have to woo. You can see that these orbs are far more mismatched color-wise, which represent their counties, than the other states. And what ends up happening is that in many respects, Pennsylvania ended up picking the President Trump because he only won there by a few thousand votes. So what we start to see if we break that infographic down is that we basically were only talking about Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan. So those three states are who determined who the president was in 2016. That in some ways is very antithetical to the argument that the Electoral College forces presidential candidates to be more broadly applicable or appealable because they actually just have to focus on specific key swing states to get to that number. Again, I don't mean to deride anybody. The point isn't to sort of tell you that you're wrong. But these are some considerations that I think almost all of you, whether you touched on some of this or your argument was in contravention to it, to really flesh out your arguments a little bit more.